This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Michaela, I can't get any... Is there sound now?
So, the last time that I met with you, we spoke primarily about argument and language analysis and a bit about text response, because we obviously hadn't gotten into the comparative component of the course, or the reading and comparing part of the course. So today we'll begin with talking about reading and comparing. We only have an hour and 15 minutes, and I do want to have at least 15 minutes for questions at the end, because I know that in English it's probably the hardest lecture to give because everybody's doing different texts, and it's obviously can't cover everyone's text. So you might have questions. If your question relates to structure and things like that, though, definitely ask it publicly so that everybody can benefit from hearing the answer. All right, I'm just going to zoom in a little bit here. Just to remind you, first of all, that comparative is section B of the VCAR exam. So people tend to write it as their second or third essay. And it does require, it's probably for most people the hardest part of the exam. There's more to do, I guess, than in the other sections. A higher level of difficulty. So just to give you an idea that in 2017, last year was the first year of the study design, and the VCAR had published a sample exam. And then the questions on the prompts on the actual exam mirrored the ones in the sample one. And there are basically 4 types. So the majority in last year's one were 8 questions with a statement and compare an idea. Yeah, so just a statement about the text. When you see the statement in a single quotation marks like that, it's not a statement from the text, it's not a quote, it's a statement about the texts. Sometimes it's not even about the text, it's just a statement about life. You know, I came, I saw, I didn't like what I saw. That kind of thing, something like that. So it can be, it's not always actually a statement, it could just be some statement generally. It could be a quote from the roller desk calendar, yeah, with a thing about the text. So a journey into nature can be extremely unpredictable. Compare the way responding to the unpredictable is explored in these texts. And in that prompt there, obviously it's not about nature, but you would also want to touch on that into some part of the answer. If you're doing, I'm assuming this is from Into the Wild and Tracks. So you want to deal with that quote, deal with what that quote says, don't ignore it, it's part of the question. But at the end it's asking you about how people respond to the unpredictable. And part of that is, of course, that nature is unpredictable. Yeah. And people are part of nature, so you might make that connection too. Yeah. People are unpredictable. Then the next type, 5 questions last year, had a quote from each text and compare an idea. I like these ones because I don't like narrow boundaries, and I feel like these ones for me, I quite like them because you can they give a bit more choice about how you read the quote. They're a bit open-ended, a bit more abstract. So if we have a look, for instance, at this one here from 1984 and Stasi Land, if you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. Sometimes that sounds quite nice. And then 1984, he who puts himself in danger will die, Stasi Land. Now, compare what the 2 texts say about the threat of punishment as a means for control. So, in this case, it's still a statement, but you're looking at those two quotes and thinking about what they might be saying in terms of similar things and different things. Lastly, there was compare an idea. Just quite simply, what do these texts suggest about human behaviour in a crisis? Yeah. And then lastly, in one case, a quote from one text with compare an idea. So they're really the only 4 types of prompts that you can get. So when you're writing them, sometimes they are, like this one's phrased as a question, so it's actually not a prompt, is it? It's a question, it's a topic. But predominantly, they are phrased as prompts, yeah, not as questions. This one's a question. In oppressive societies, there is little possibility for trust. What do these texts suggest about the nature of trust? So they're the only types of things that you can get. If you've been seeing other kinds of prompts, they will be phrased like one of those prompts. The examiners have said that in their examiner's report. Hopefully you've also had an opportunity to read this already, but we'll just quickly look at the reading and comparing section from the examiner's report from last year. So I've highlighted the key parts here. Students should not come to the examination with prepared responses. It is important that students carefully read and analyse the wording of the topic they choose to respond to and plan and craft a response that directly responds to that particular topic. Recently I was marking my students' practice acts, and we did two practice acts for comparative, and the second practice act was on a completely different topic, but sometimes I could see the previous topic we'd done in the answer. So they were addressing the new topic, but not with fresh eyes. They were trying to, save time by using quotes and ideas from the previous one they'd done in this one. And you don't want to do that. You need to prepare for each topic and each kind of topic as though it's a fresh thing. Not recycling ideas just for the sake of it. Oh, that was a fancy line. I got 3 ticks next to that line that I said in the last essay. Yeah, but it doesn't relate to this one. So be wary. They hate that. That's number one, because, of course, it's really... I think that when they see a prepared response, what they feel that they're doing is awarding good coaching or good routine. And that isn't good English or good thinking. It's just hard work. And hard work should be rewarded. But just like in every subject, the person who usually gets 49 and 50 in English, generally speaking, in your class, is the student who innately is the best in English. They're actually not often... They work hard, but they're also innately good at it. Just because something's compulsory doesn't mean it shouldn't reward. It's like in physics, isn't it? It's like how sometimes there's that year 8 kid who's a genius and just comes into year 12 physics and gets 50. It's the same with English. Just because it's compulsory, there are some people who work less hard than you will, who work less hard, but they're just better at it. And they should be rewarded. You're getting rewarded for 2 things: hard work, but also talent. And talent isn't recycling a previous essay or slightly tweaking it. And it does. You can see it. You can see it as soon as it happens. This is just, it's kind of, they're talking around this question. I wouldn't say they're not dealing with the question, but they're talking around it. The topics mirrored the different styles and wordings presented in the sample written examination published by VCAR. So that's like the ones I just went over you. All 16 topics included the verb compare, so there's no confusion about the task. The themes and ideas offered to students for exploration were accessible, and few students had difficulties dealing with the key ideas of the topics. The challenge for this section, and this is important, was in showing the capacity to make comparisons and contrasts seamlessly between the 2 texts, with a sense of balanced textual awareness and analytically informed and supported insights provided throughout. While it is useful to employ terms such as similarly, in contrast, or mirroring this, these in themselves are not comparison. And there's nothing more frustrating than when you read that parallel-wise, and you're like, well, you just said a point that's different. It's not parallel-wise at all. It's the opposite. Or similarly, and then the idea has nothing to do with what the previous point was. So be careful. I think avoid those words unless you're going to give them an immediate qualifier. How is it similar? How does it run parallel? The comparison, which of course includes significant differences as well as similarities, still needs to be developed and needs to be explicit in the exploration of the text and the topics. Students who offered a detailed description of one text and then the other, with only the word similarly in between, were not comparing, but simply offering a general narrative about the texts, and there's a case and an example there. On the other hand, the high-scoring response used the same term, but then elaborated on similarities throughout the paragraphs. So you can read over this. It's freely available. Make sure that you go to VCAR's website and check out these sample ones. And my advice would be to read the sample extracts even from the text that you haven't studied. Because what you're able to then see is the vocabulary they're using to compare, the structure that they compare with for the highest scoring ones. It tells you whether they're low scoring, mid scoring or high scoring. And being able to actually see how they actively compare. Yeah. My students in this task tend to write 3 body paragraphs as opposed to 4. I don't know that there's a rule with that, but I think it maybe that enables them to have a richer comparison. Yeah. I think it is. Oh no, I'll get it put up on the thing. Yeah, I'll get it put up on the thing. Yeah. Although it's pretty straightforward, you don't need to have really. You probably don't need it. There are no specific expectations about the way in which students structure their responses. I get asked this constantly, and it drives me mad. It doesn't matter how you structure it, as long as it's comparative. You know, do you have a long introduction? And some of my students say, oh, I'm struggling to write a conclusion. And I say, well, just make sure you finish with a line that's comparative. You don't need... Good comparison throughout is the key point. How you achieve that is up to you. There are no specific expectations about the way in which students structure their responses. Students are free to put their ideas together in a manner they feel best fulfills the requirements of the task. This was set out clearly in the examination, to develop a discussion of meaningful connections, similarities or differences between the texts, so drawing distinctions between them, in response to the topic, and make use of textual evidence to support the comparative analysis. So you still need to be able to give textual evidence, whether that's in the form of quotes, literary techniques, tropes, metaphors and so on, or through citing the events of the text. Students should continue to work on comparison as the basis for discussing and exploring the set topics and to discover the approaches and structure that best fulfil this. This includes ensuring a consistent and assured focus on the central idea or issue presented by the topic, considering meaningful contrasts as well as similarities, which may shed meaningful light on the distinctive ways in which the texts explore ideas. Avoid excessive plot focus or lengthy descriptive passages that fail to shed light on the issue for consideration. In the case of the text, you have to think about already the very things that make them different from the outset. Are they of the same genre? Are they of the same form? Are they from the same epoch? Is their writer from the same context? So if we take Stars in London 1984 as an example, well, obviously one text is non-fiction. One text is speculative fiction, imagining a future. One text is written by an Australian in Germany, visiting East Germany, about a real society that she didn't live in. And one text is written by a British man writing about a hypothetical world in the 1940s. One text is, funnily enough, although both of the texts are exploring issues of like class and class warfare and ideology about economic and political ideology, both of them are written by privileged people. One a man, one a woman. But, you know. So, think about, depending on what your text is, like who's doing Ransom and Invictus. Like think about Ransom and Invictus, they're completely different contexts. But what they do share in common is they're published in the same year. So Ransom and Invictus came out at the same time, 2008. But one is an Australian novel written for a literary audience, retelling a story from Greek myth, from classical Greece, and the other one's a Hollywood film by one of Hollywood's most famous and arguably, in my opinion, overrated directors. Yeah. So, overrated / borderline racist directors, but don't let that get out. Anyway, but essentially, you know, their contexts are different. And also, yes, they're both set in 2008, but for instance, Invictus is a film that tells the story of apartheid, set in 1994, 1996, I think, actually, a couple of years after the end of apartheid, South Africa. And the other one's telling a story set 2,500 years ago. Longer, actually. And one is, and yet, Invictus is not made for a South African audience. It's a big budget film. Morgan Freeman and Matt Damon. It's made for Americans. And funnily enough, made for Americans in the 2 years leading up to the president, their first black president, whom the director Clint Eastwood couldn't stand. Eastwood couldn't stand Obama as a president. So, you need to think about what they're writing about. ransom, for instance, is about, it might be set in that great story of that classical Greek story, but it's also, for its Australian audience, he's thinking about the apology to the stolen generations. He's thinking about boat people. He's thinking about the focus on difference rather than on similarity. So the context, the form, the genre, when the texts were published, who wrote them, they're the most immediate things to think about as points of distinction and similarity. You know? Who the texts are made for, written for, is important. All right. Let's have a look at how we deal with breaking down some prompts. I've given you a handout here, if you could turn to it there, this one. So it's got like a section B on the front. I'll also put it up here if you don't have it with you, but you can get it at the end. I think this is it, yeah. So essentially these are the things that you need to think about comparing: form, genre, narrative structure, the writer and director's context, possible aims or purposes, views and values. That includes their audience. Who's doing, at our school, we're doing the Crucible and Year of Wonders. Who else is doing that one? Yeah, it's probably the most popular one, actually. In this context, you know, like so often I'll read these interpretations of Arthur Miller that are feminist, and it's like, well, Arthur Miller's not a feminist. He's writing in the 1950s, and yes, he might be more progressive than most men of the 1950s, but he's not a feminist. And so that's okay, you can give that reading of the text, and you can talk about that, but that's not his intention, so you have to make that distinction clear. This is a reading. You're offering a reading, it's your reading. It's an understanding of the contemporary reading of the play. It's strange too, like, I think if you take texts that are, like if you think about, you know, Into the Wild and Tracks, I mean, they're texts that are kind of exploring a pretty similar theme, like the idea of going and exploring and travelling, but very, very different protagonists. We kind of feel frustration. Gender is such an important part of those two texts. Is anyone doing Into the Wild and Tracks? You know, our own attitudes as readers to men and women who take, like, both characters reject civilization kind of to go into the, well, and one does it in this really egotistical way, you know, and the other one does it in this kind of, to prove it to herself. Whereas, so one of them is proving it to other people. I'm rejecting, you know, the guy in Into the Wild is rejecting American kind of materialism and consumerism and proving that to his middle-class family that he can do this. And in the other one, she's rejecting, she's not trying to prove anything to anyone other than to herself. So thinking about those, and also one is written by the actual person who did it, and the other one is written by someone who knew that person. So you have to think about these things when you're comparing from the outset. Yes, there's the prompt, the topic that you'll get, but if you think about what's similar and what's different and how that connects or how that relates to the prompt, it will already set up things for you to link to. Yeah. Think about the symbolism and imagery that's used. It might not be exactly the same kind of imagery and symbolism. Sometimes it is. Sometimes I might use the same motif, yeah? Like, for instance, I think you can tell sometimes, like in Year of Wonders and Crucible, you can tell that Geraldine Brooks has read and is influenced by the Crucible, partly. Not entirely. Likewise with Stasi Lennon 1984, it's quite clear that Thunder is familiar with 1984. She actually makes references to some of the quotes from it at times. So in those cases, you know that the authors of the later texts have read the earlier texts. So when you're thinking about that, that might indeed relate to your comparing. They're not necessarily endorsing those texts, though, or every aspect of them. No, they might be critiquing them. Finally, the last one down there, the themes, which is a word you should avoid using, obviously. What can be garnered about how and why the writers explore these themes, the views and values expressed? How do the themes interrelate? What does the exploration of these themes reveal to 21st century audiences? Because at the end of it also, you need to think about, yes, there's the audience. I always think about the text in this way. When is it set? In what time frames? There might be more than one, depending if it's jumps time frames or not. In what context is it being written? What's the writer's context? And then the context in which you're reading it. Why has VCAR put it on the text list? That's the key to think about as well. All right. Although most of the sample plans I've used here are from Ransom and Invictus and the Crucible and Year of Wonders, generally because they tend to be the two most common, the students wrote last year wrote most on those two pairs. What I want to do is we'll have a look at the prompt, we'll break down our ideas about it, and you don't necessarily need to know about the text to be able to get something out of the reading of these samples. So, first things first, when we see a prompt, only a select few seem capable of the courage necessary to effect social change. So it's just a simple quote. Compare the ways in which Ransom and Invictus deal with the notion of courage and heroism. So first things first, what do we see? Only a select few seem capable of the courage necessary to effect social change. What does that make you think about? Doesn't matter whether you've read the text or not, just generally. Do you think it's true? Sometimes it is, but what else? Is it always true? What else can affect social change? What else can affect social change? Yeah, like a collective effort. Yeah, that's true, yeah. Actually, I would argue that probably happens more often. Maybe one individual's involved, but on the whole it's a push. Like in a revolution, it's not one person. And arguably it's the people who the change affects that need to be the courageous ones, not just the ones who are instigating the change. It's pretty easy to say, all right, you're off to war, but I'm going to sit up here in British Parliament and get my shoes polished by the maid. Do you know what I mean? It's the change is also impacting the courage, and the courage required to endure the change is often felt by the people at the coalface. And also, is it good change? Yeah. There's good and bad change. What's it in aid of? Is it necessary? Compare the ways in which Ransom and Invictus, so we're just thinking that's easy, but deal with the notion. So this is a key word to think about, the notion. What does that mean like this? What's the notion as opposed to... Why does it not just say deal with ideas about courage and heroism? The notion of... What does it create? To me it creates a sense of doubt. Like a notion, it's like, not particularly strong. Do you know what I mean? Like I've got a bit of a notion, it's more a sense of it, rather than maybe the actual thing. Yeah? Of courage and heroism, and you always must be careful in text response as well as in comparison of these words that separated by and, which so often people mistake as synonyms for one another. And courage and heroism are not the same thing. Not in the slightest. You can have one without the other, can't you? Well, you can't... Well, actually, you probably can have heroism without courage, actually. Yeah. But you could definitely have courage without heroism. All right. So let's have a look how this student here has dealt with the question. This is a introduction and plan. So there's an introduction, and then the student's gone through and written topic and linking sentences, and then there's advice about what to do in the conclusion. So let's have a look. Self-preservation and self-advancement do often require bravery, but they are not in and of themselves necessarily courageous aims. Both Ransom and Invictus explore the kind of courage that involves the personal risk and self-sacrifice to do something new, something unimaginable. Clint Eastwood and David Malouf suggest that true courage is to ask not what you can do for yourself, but what you can do for others. The men portrayed in these texts do not see themselves as heroes, but many others regard them this way. Even though the problems that plagued South Africa in the early post-apartheid setting of Invictus and which threaten the ancient city of Troy in ransom, are not entirely resolved. Mandela, Francois, Priam, Achilles and Somax, and their characters from both the texts, exhibit the self-sacrifice that is required to change others' attitudes and better the lives of their countrymen, even if only momentarily. Maloof imagines a forgotten or suppressed story from the Iliad to exhibit how true courage is shown not on the battlefield but in the actions of the everyday person, while Invictus highlights how heroism comes from putting others first. So it's giving a very direct comparative, active comparative point that points out similarities and differences. There are differences in these texts, and it makes it clear from the outset. And you need to too. Your texts are actually probably more different than they are similar, really. I mean, they're works of art, and good works of art don't have mirrors generally. So you go, that's why they're innovative and so on. So actually, most often you'll be wanting to point out the distinctions as much as the similarities. And then what's key is, and what's so often important, what can happen in a comparative essay is you do the comparison, but you never actually say what the point of it is. That's what happens with a lot of students. And I'll get to the end and I get to this, like, the paragraph kind of stops on an example from the text or one text. And I'm like, you've led me to the water and then you've, taken the drink away. You open, I just got to the pub and you shut it in my face. You need to do the interpretation. This is what the difference between analysing and interpreting is. Analysing is where you're analysing what the text is showing about the prompt. But if you don't finish with an interpretive point about it, you're leaving the assessor to do that, and they don't do that. They're not going to do that. They're not your teacher. So here we have, while Mandela and Priam both have their own interests at stake when pursuing change, this does not remain their main aim. So it's saying that, hang on, partly they're courageous, but they're also self-interested. The need to effect a change often requires a person with power to have the courage to risk their pride, their position of authority, and sometimes their life. So from this to this, the student will take me through showing me how they start off start off as self-interested, or more self-interested, or they're motivated partly by self-interest, but gradually that becomes the secondary. They put that self-interest at risk for the sake of a greater cause. And they'll show us that through that paragraph to enter that point. Yeah? If I go through a student's essay and I can't highlight the opening sentence and the final sentence of the paragraph and see the prompt, I should almost not have to read. I could almost read a good essay first by just reading the opening couple of sentences of each paragraph and the closing sentence or two of each paragraph. And I should be able to see the prompt. And not just observations about it, interpretation about it in those opening and closing sentences. The next one says, false courage and bravado that clings stubbornly to old ways is presented negatively by Maloof and Eastwood. So if you think about this idea of the prompt, it's about change as well as courage and heroism. So it's not about courage and heroism just in and of itself, it's about courage and heroism in the context of change. So this quote, this topic sentence says that change is necessary. False courage and bravado that clings stubbornly to old ways is presented negatively by Maloof and Eastwood. Resilience, determination, empathy and maintaining a mind that is open to new strategies is integral to improving society, is the linking sentence. It is not just those with power and privilege who are required to show courage. The texts show that often the greatest courage comes from the loyalty and endurance of ordinary people who find themselves in a situation they would never have expected. So now we're moving to a challenge to the topic. What it's not doing is ignoring it. You don't want to say, you don't want to look at the prompt and say, I don't agree with it. It's like, when you have see those questions on text response and it'll be about a character. I'll say, I don't know, Joe Bloggs is the most important character in, I don't know, whatever. Jesus is the most important character in the Bible. And then you write an essay where you're like one paragraph showing they're important and then how are the other paragraph. That's not how you should deal with that, a topic like that. Jesus should be in every paragraph. So he's the focus of the question. Like if you say, I don't know, like what's a Abigail is the biggest victim in the crucible, or whatever. You don't write a paragraph where Abigail is, if it was a text response, Abigail is shown to be a victim, but she's not the biggest, and here are all the other ones who are. It's not maths. It's not evaluating. Suffering is relative. Suffering is relative to the experience of the sufferer. So what you do in that context is look at, well, how does Abigail suffer, and in each paragraph compare that with other people suffering, and what are the texts saying about suffering through the experiences of Abigail and the other characters, rather than an evaluation of it. Yeah. And then finally, in this one, perhaps the greatest courage shown in Ransom and Invictus is the everyday kind, of the sort which requires people to endure suffering and tribulation, but still remain hopeful of a way forward. Then the final section of your comparative essay must be reconciling the end of the texts. What happens at the end of them? Imagine if you deal with the text but you don't deal with the resolution. You've got to think about how the texts are resolved to address the question, because that's how the reader's left. So by the end of your essay, you should be dealing with the end of the texts, if you haven't already. And the other thing near the end of the essay is you want to come back to that relationship between the texts and think about the text. Remember that the texts are constructed by someone, for other people. In your third paragraph for your conclusion or your conclusion, you need to be thinking about that relationship between the people who produced these texts, constructed them, the artists, the writers, the poets, whatever they are, short stories, filmmakers, and their intended audience, and you as a reader or watcher. Society is always in a state of change, and sometimes it may seem as though people have little control over their destiny, yet both texts express the need to make a decisive choice. So they're saying, well, actually, sometimes courage comes from being able to actually realise that I don't get to decide everything, and being okay with that. Both texts show great people where sometimes things are out of their hands, powerful men who don't always have control. Overcoming a need for vengeance and instead focusing on a way forward, learning to love your enemy as one of your fellow man, requires the kind of courage that Maloof and Eastwood endorse. Yeah. And then I've written here, in the conclusion, return to the topic by extending explicitly on the ideas raised in the introduction in a culminating way. Don't repeat yourself. The conclusion shouldn't be repetitive of the earlier points. It should be an extension of them. Not new ideas, but an extension on the ones you've raised. Not a repetition of them. The examiner is not an idiot. They don't need to read it the third time. The introduction, the topic sentence, and then again in the conclusion. It should be extending on those ideas you raised, coming back to the relationship in the conclusion between the writers, the filmmakers, and their audience. We'll have a look at a sample one in a minute. Ensure you write eloquently and end with a meaningful, revelatory and poignant sentence. Be sure to address the author's and director's possible aims and ideas re the topic. Be mindful of the context of the audiences for these texts and consider this in relation to the prompt. All right, I'm going to go down to one here on the Crucible. This is one, so my student wrote a SAC last year. This was our SAC topic last year, and then I've typed up the essay and added things and so on to try and complete it. First of all, let's all have a think about the prompt together. You don't have to have read the Crucible or Year of Wonders. Think about your own texts. Few people have complete control over their own lives. Compare the way the two texts explore this idea. So, who has control over their life? Or who has more or less control? None of us do, let's be honest, right? No one really has complete control. The word complete is the absolute there. But what can we think about the prompt in terms of what you know about life? About control? Well, I'm looking at this audience here, I'm looking around and I'm like, okay, let me find someone. Like maybe, I could be wrong, but like maybe this guy in front of me in the black, like he's probably got more control than a lot of you. Yeah. I don't know, maybe I'm presumptuous, right? He's like Anglo, and he's a man, and he's kind of tall, he's white, and given that he's in a lecture at Melbourne Uni, he's probably middle class. So chances are He's got a lot of control compared to some of the rest of us. Certainly compared to 99% of the world's population. So we start to see that actually if we look at this idea of few people have control over their lives, it's a question about power. Isn't it? It's a prompt about power. Maybe the person in question is not like a power maniac, but like the point is that there's an inherent power anyway. And that means responsibility. So it's about power, it's about responsibility, it's about the thing. So let's have a read and see how this one here deals with the topic. It doesn't matter if you haven't read the text, you should be reading for how they write comparatively, analytically, interpretively. Likewise when you read the examiner's report. Arthur Miller, in his tragic polemic The Crucible, 1953, and Geraldine Brooks in her work of historical revisionism, Year of Wonders, 2001, depict provincial 17th century societies where oppression is used by those weighted with authority to control others. So can you see, like the last one, it gives the genre, it says what's similar in the opening line. They're both set in 17th century societies where oppression is used by powerful people. And there's a quote, a very brief one, but giving textual flair, textual character from the outset. Brooks highlights the struggle for women to find autonomy within entrenched patriarchal structures, whereas Miller directs his criticism toward the fundamentalist religious ideologues who misused their control in Salem, allegorising American McCarthyism in the 1950s through the events of Salem in 1692. So it points out the different authorial contexts, the different places from which the texts are written, the different foci of the authors. Both texts, now we're back to comparison again, from contrast, both texts convey that it is crucial for the individual to resist an unduly controlling authority, even while acknowledging the dangers of doing so. It's all very easy, isn't it, to say resist, but it's much harder in practice, particularly if you're deeply oppressed. Like, resist, but get shot. Oh, no, I'll just stay quiet. Yeah. It's easy for us in the West to be like, resist, we're on the protest, we're resisting, occupy, or whatever you call it. But it's much harder. We're protesting about animals being live exported. And I saw a thing the other night on what's happening to the Rohingya in, the live exports. But like I said, suffering is relative, I guess, but maybe not between animals and human beings. It's not relative then. It's different. Sorry to say. It's the animal libs people, but it is different. So I think the thing is that what we start to see is that this is saying quite politically, yes, it's crucial for the individual to resist an unduly controlling authority. The texts are about that, about power. But it's also dangerous to resist it. The events that befall Eam and Salem, they're the two towns where the texts are set, also condemn those who seek to regain their own sense of control by morally persecuting the vulnerable during the seemingly insoluble crises in which people feel the times are out of joint. So it says that the texts also condemn those people who have a lot of control and want to consolidate it, or are frightened because there's bad things are happening and they're worried about losing control. So actually the prompt's saying that, in a way, the people who have the most control are often the most diabolical because they are not accustomed to having it. When a crisis happens, they're not accustomed to having it jeopardised. So, likewise, it goes through, and then you'll see how it links. There's 3 paragraphs, and each one has the red parts are the comparisons. Well, there's 4 paragraphs in this one. Yeah. All right. We'll read through it. Doesn't really matter whether you've read the text, and see how they're doing it. In Brooks's novel and in Miller's play, the patriarchal negation of female agency and autonomy is depicted as destructive. So the first one is about a reading from the perspective of a female perspective in the text. After all, one is about a witch hunt. Donald Trump keeps claiming that it's a witch hunt, but it can't be a witch hunt for him because not only is he a man, witch hunts are against the powerless, not the powerful. You can't be a powerful object of a witch hunt. Yeah? It's just propaganda. The repressive climate for the girls in Salem serves as a catalyst for their paroxysm and frenzied accusations. Led by Abigail, the young women misuse their intoxicating newfound power because they have always been deprived of any personal volition to determine the course of their own lives. So few people have complete control, that's the prompt. Suddenly these girls feel they've got some, but they haven't. And because they haven't ever had any, they don't really know how to use what little they've suddenly got. This is evident through Mary Warren, a meek and ordinary maidservant of 18 who raises her chin like a prince. After becoming... Is that working? Yeah. After becoming an official of the court, but cannot but wish to go to bed when finally offered a chance to assert her will. Mary is first subjugated by Proctor and later by Danforth. In addition, Miller's play reveals that the total suppression of female sexuality and the associated but deeply repressed shame wrought by this is what prompts Abigail's initial offloading of her sin and her subsequent vengeful accusations. Due to her endless capacity for dissembling, she capitulates quickly to Reverend Hale and deflects her own shame and the blame for dancing by making a scapegoat of women lower on the pecking order than her. So, what you'll notice is, have you noticed that the way that it quotes is lots of frequent short quotes? Not big long slabs of text. Frequent short quotes. Sometimes the quotes, what you have to make sure is that you don't just use quotes as filler though. They need to be quotes that relate. Some of them need to relate. You can have your filler ones that give character and flair and so on, show that you know the text well, but some of them need to be directly to the topic. Yeah, so you need to have made sure that you've gathered quotes. Don't gather quotes, don't make lists of quotes that are not applied. They must be applied quotes. That's the best way to memorise quotes. And never double up. Like make your list, get your list of 10 different prompts and gather the best quotes about those prompts. Scour the text until you find the 20 best quotes about that particular prompt. And yes, some of them might relate to the next prompt that you look at, but find another 20. Cut and paste in the ones that relate from the previous one, but also find another 20. And you will find that you'll remember the quotes much better. And then once you've got the list, go back and actually look at that quote, at each and every one of them, and analyse them. When you analyse the quote and what's contained within it, you know, it's like an actor remembering their lines. The actor remembers their lines when they remember what they mean, not just the words. Why is my character saying this? Who are they saying it to? What is the mood when they say it? What is the playwright trying to say or the filmmaker trying to say through this line? And then the actor can remember the line. Due to her endless capacity for dissembling, Abigail capitulates quickly to Reverend Hale and deflects her own shame and the blame for dancing by making a scapegoat of women lower on the pecking order than her. This appeases her households and the town's patriarchal figurehead, Reverend Parris, about whom Miller writes very little good can be said, largely because his focus is solely on maintaining his power and control, rather than on exhibiting the selflessness expected of a minister of religion and dealing with the girls with compassion. I mean, he's a minister. He should be compassionate to these girls dancing in the forest. And instead, he remonstrates with them. Why? Because he's so fearful. And yet he's supposed to have control. The Crucible reveals how, in an authoritarian society, people who are oppressed quickly oppress others because there is no room for them to question the entrenched authority. Yeah? It's like divide and conquer. It's the best way for the powerful to keep power, isn't it? Classic one. Probably do it when you have a fight with them. They're trying to suss you out, like who was bullying whom. They use the divide and conquer tactic. So it's age old. The vulnerability of the lower class women in Salem is due in large part to active and internalised patriarchal oppression. This makes them the most obvious victims of those who exert control, which is why they turn on one another and the town. You know? The reality is, the cliche about women, which isn't true anyway, but sometimes it seems to be, I guess, in the culture. If a woman is a manipulative, you know what, then it's because men have made them that way, or patriarchy, not individual men. Because if you don't have direct recourse to power, how do you get it? You don't get it as much as you should, but you manipulate for it. It's age-old. And it's the same in this context. The women in the crucible. And for Miller, writing from the 1950s context, he's kind of critical of this. You know, the women, those young girls are shown, but they're victims too, and he knows that. Yeah, Abigail Williams is a victim and a perpetrator. So it says, the crucible reveals how people oppress others because there is no room for them to question the entrenched authority. The vulnerability of the lower class women in Salem is due in large part to active and internalised patriarchal oppression. This makes them the most obvious victims of those who exert control, which is why they turn on one another in the town. Writing almost 50 years later than Miller, Geraldine Brooks even more overtly positions readers of her revisionist historical novel to see the lack of autonomy for women across the centuries. Yet she does more hopefully depict some semblance of female self-definition through Anna Frith's sorority, or sisterhood, with Eleanor Montpellion and her high regard for Anise Gowdy. Anice's sexual and intellectual freedom is, however, too threatening for the people of Eyam, and hence they lynch the one woman who has the skill to fight the plague. Even in the novel's hopeful denouement, Anna Frith herself is not truly free of patriarchal control. She must take Ahmed Bey's name if she wishes to practice medicine, and must eschew her own sexuality too. While Year of Wonders is a novel about a woman's self-actualisation, and in this it offers more hope than does The Crucible, it does show that very few, if any, women have complete control over their own lives, and that too often women must compromise their autonomy to survive. Now, this student has clearly, she's a feminist and she's interested in feminism. And she's made this paragraph, and the rest of the text doesn't talk about women any specifically, but she's made this paragraph fit the prompt. It's dealing with the prompt all the way through. But it doesn't now. If the essay just went on and kept talking about women and control, it would not be sufficient. So if we have a quick look at the next one, next topic in linking sentences, we'll just read the red bits. Both Brooks and Miller depict how fundamentalist dogma and binary Manichaean conventions of light and dark oppressively control people and limit their ability to think for themselves. So it's about how people don't have control because they're ideologically, blind. They're in servitude, essentially, to an ideology. The reason such authorities, whether in Salem or elsewhere, are not more circumspect is because they believe so righteously and unquestioningly in their own sanctimonious ideology. Therefore, due to their deep indoctrination, they also do not have complete control over their reprehensible modus operandi, although they certainly fail in meeting their greater responsibility to act morally. So the idea is here that some people with control have a moral responsibility to use the control wisely, and they failed. However, there are some authority figures in Salem and Eyam, such as Reverend Hale and Rector Montpellion, who are from two different texts, who are able to transcend their position as ideologues who presume God's will. Brooks, like Miller, suggests that while we may have little control over our own lives, this does not absolve people who bear witness to gross injustice or human suffering and do nothing. So essentially it's working through, and you'll notice that the bits in the red are where it's about ideas and comparing and contrasting the interpretation. This is you. It's your interpretation. You have to show that you've learned something about human beings and societies from reading. Otherwise, what was the point of 13 years at schooling? You could be a maniac going into the world for all they know. So you need to show that you have learnt something, and to do that you have to interpret. Analysing is a skill, but interpretation is intellect. Yeah. So that's key. Before we move on to looking at text response, and you can read over some of these samples, are there any more questions on comparative? Let's have any questions to ask. Yes? Yeah, you don't want to do it to the expense of close analysis, but yes, you should. You should be mindful of it. Yeah.
To what extent, should you be mainly focusing on comparing the content as opposed to the context?
Yeah, but just you have to remember that everything is still an artifice. Yeah. Like even in the non-fiction text like Stasiland, there's still works of art. Yeah, I think it needs to be a sense. I think what they actually ask for is like an awareness. How explicit you make that awareness, I think that, like, if you look at the descriptors, that's the word they use, an awareness. And likewise with the prompt, they ask for, the word they use is the implications. So awareness and implications, think about those words. What you don't want to do, however, is go on a diatribe or give the entire historical context of the texts. Yeah? Then it becomes a history essay. Yeah? Or a sociology essay or something. Yeah. No. Any other questions on comparative? Everyone's clear? No one's concerned about structure? No? All right. We'll move on to text response. The next handout here has some information on text response. So if you've got the other one, but I'll put it up here as well. I've used a text that no one's that's went off the study design already, but that's probably good because then you're reading it for the advice rather than for the text itself. So basically, this is the best part of the course, I think. If you've studied well, you like reading, you're a good thinker, you've done the work, it should be the area. A good text response essay can actually move you. It can actually be moving. I've read text response essays that have been so perceptive and insightful that they've actually, made a salty discharge. I don't want to use the word tear, but yeah. Brought a tear to the eye. So, how do I just zoom in here? Control plus, is it? Yeah. So first of all, your questions are either going to be one of the following five. You're going to have a character-based questions, thinking about their interrelationships, their views and values, differences and similarities, as well as the narrative or literary significance of the characters. Who's doing short stories for text response? One? Yeah, it's a little different in that case, obviously. Yeah, you have to think about characters moving across text and pick characters. Is anyone doing poetry for text response? Yeah, so again, there are characters in poems, but it's a little more abstract. Yeah. Their interrelationships, their views and values, differences and similarities. Often you'll read students, and I talked about this in the literature lecture, you'll often read students talk about the character as a vehicle for, or a tool to, or something like that. And that can be okay, that's okay to do that. But they're still people, and they're meant to be, obviously they're made up most of the time, unless it's non-fiction. But they're still meant to be read as people. If you don't feel something for them as people, then it's not a very good book. Do you know? So you don't want to just think about the characters as an avenue for something. Sometimes it's not always big picture themes. Sometimes they're exploring human things, that are emotions rather than ideas. Yeah. Thematic or socially based questions. The question can, there's two questions obviously, but generally speaking they'll cover one or more of these. It might be looking at the play's views and values or the novel's views and values, to comment and reflect on the real world at the time of its setting. They might be authorial based, looking at how the playwright, this is because it's a play, but the author, the playwright, the filmmaker, whatever, uses literary and theatrical techniques or filmic techniques or poetic techniques, genre, symbology, language and narrative to create meaning. So what's the author doing? Sometimes they're those questions. If you see the word how, for instance, in the question, that often indicates that. How is it being done? And then lastly, it can sometimes be reader response based. Like I said, if you have a question like, Angelo is the only despicable character in Measure for Measure, for instance, it's asking for a reader response. It's saying, yes, it's about character, but it's also about, well, how do you respond to that? Yeah? Usually, whatever the question, you will need to show at least an implicit awareness of all of the above. So you actually need to kind of, despite the question, be dealing with it all. If the question's about a character, it's also about the themes. If the question's about Medea and Jason, well, it's about pragmatism and passion. Medea embodying one and Jason the other. It's about the foreigner. Yeah, it's about race, because Medea is not, is from the Caucasus and not Greek. So it's about xenophobia, things like that. Usually, whatever the question, you'll need to show an implicit awareness of all of the above. Questions can also be phrased in different ways, and here are the examples of some of the phrasings from last year's exam. Do you agree? Do you agree with this view of? To what extent do you agree? Discuss. Just an imperative statement with nothing else, so just an imperative one statement. A quote from the text followed by a statement about it. A quote by a critic or reviewer about the text followed by a statement or a question. A statement about the play, or the text in this case, followed by a why. A statement followed by a how. How does this affect your reading of the play, the novel, the film, whatever? How important it is, and in what way. So these were the different ways that questions can be phrased, and that means that you do have to kind of take a different approach, because if you think about this, for instance, it's a little bit more evaluative. So you need to give some of them will require more opinion, essentially. Obviously not a strident one, whereas this is obviously a little more abstract. So we're just going to use these two questions to have a look at how you would unpack the two examples of questions. In Cozzy's play, what does Lewis learn by directing the play? To what extent are the characters in Cozzy defined by their idealism? So Cozzy is a play about a play, by the way. So one is about a character, but it's not really just about a character, is it? Because what Lewis learns, or doesn't learn as the case may be, and what it says about theatre and the role of theatre and the function of theatre, and what we learn about Lewis's character, you don't need to know about who Lewis is what the question needs to be about that. Obviously it's not just about Lewis. But what you wouldn't want to do, and which some students would do, is write, here are the things that Lewis learns about the play, and here's what other people learn about through being in the play. Because the different characters are all in a play. They're all in the play. There's a director, the actors, and so on. You know the story of Cozzy? It's about a play put on at an insane asylum. So Lewis is like, like the community service worker who has to he gets hired from the local council to put on a play at a madhouse, like in the nut house. It's Australian. And then here, to what extent are the characters in Cozzy defined by their idealism? So the opposite being reason. So, obviously the above questions, the second one asking to what extent, need to be challenged or questioned themselves. Most importantly, you must never forget that a text, a play, a novel, a film is a construct. It's not real. And implicit within these questions is a why. Why did the author do it that way? Even in a Stasi-Land or a non-fiction text, it's still constructed. In a film that's a documentary is even constructed. Stories we tell is a construct. You must ask why in relation to what, in your view, the author wants the audience or the filmmaker to garner, and why. Why, when you're doing this, if you're a good writer, a good filmmaker, whatever it is, you're always thinking, how will what I'm doing here make my intended reader feel or think? Yeah. That's what you're thinking about. It has to be honest to the character, but you're also thinking about that. Because otherwise you've got no audience. You must ask, a strong intellect will do the following. You'll explore both facets of any question. What are the implications in the question? You have to reconcile it. I always say to my students, have a contention, but have a contention with a clause. Yeah? So it's a contention with a clause. You know what I mean by that. We'll look at a sample one in a minute to see. Elaborate where necessary. Yeah? Take the question and question it. Ask questions of it. You ask questions of the question. Not just using the text. Yes, use the text. But also ask questions from life about it. If I think and say, okay, well, what does Lewis learn by directing a play? What would you learn from directing a play if you've never directed a play before? What might you learn? You might learn that people get nervous on stage. You might learn that it's not that easy to stand up and be, although sometimes it is. Sometimes it's easy for some people because they like to be other people. It's better to stand up and be a character than be yourself. Or you might say, well, what are players used to do? I mean, I think about Shakespeare and I'm like, all of life is a stage and all of us merely players who have our parts. Yeah? And that idea that essentially we're all performing in a play all the time. And these people in the insane asylum in Cozzy aren't very good performers at real life. That's why they're in the insane asylum. Provide rebuttal and counter-rebuttal where necessary. Of the topic. Show an awareness that the text is a construct and that it can be interpreted in multiple ways. It's not just one reading there. You want to show at least that there's two possible ways of reading the text. Yeah? Or a part of the text, if not the whole thing. Show an awareness that the text is a vehicle through which to comment on universal humanity, socio-political and cultural issues and concerns in an entertaining and engaging way. Show an awareness using meta-language terminology of how meaning in the work is created. All right. Accordingly, when you outline your contention in the introduction, as you must also acknowledge some form of clause or qualifying comment. Writers of sophisticated texts present complex issues in subtle and nuanced ways and are very rarely didactic. Do you know what didactic means? Hit you over the head with their message, like a subtle as a sledgehammer kind of thing. Reductive or black and white. Their texts are almost always open to questioning and critique from disparate viewpoints. Cosy is a play about which an essay should have the power to emotionally move the assessor. That is, the play deals with universal human issues and experiences that are explored in a sensitive and moving way, and that's true of all the texts on the text list. So, having a look at a contention with a clause in an introduction, to what extent are the characters in Cosy defined by their idealism? Don't begin with in Louis Naura's Cosy or in Shakespeare's Measure for Measure, because you're supposed to be the best students and 43,000 other people will begin with those 4 or 5 words. To aim for the stars, is that such a bad thing, suggests Louis Naura's play Cosy, as it dramatises the vaguely absurd project of a group of Australian mental patients who can't sing or speak Italian, rehearsing for Mozart's opera buffa Così fan tutti. It says genre, it's a dark comedy. It says form, it's a play. It opens with an engaging quote straight away. It makes a comment about what the author is doing, just in that sentence. It's doing so many things in that opening sentence that it needs to do. That sentence is getting 4 points. Yes?
I'm told over and over not to put quotes into the introduction, and usually even if there are quotes in the prompts, try to avoid as much as possible. But you start with the quote, how do you...
I would use quotes as much as you can. Provided that you use them. There's nothing worse than quotes that are just plonked there. Provided the quote's always given context grammatically and thematically. You know, that it is hard, but no, I think the more the merrier. The more, as many as possible. Provided that they're not just, you know, some of them need to be meaningful. But no, I mean, I think I tell my students the opposite. You should, I'm not their opening line, but this is just an example that happened, but I think the introduction should include quoted evidence in it. I think there's this assumption too sometimes that like there's a formula for English essays. You know, it's compulsory and that you should stick to a formula. But no, the best English students should be writing like literature students anyway. You know what I mean? Like really, you know, the formulas are there for you, and you teach students the formulas to give them a guide, but really, it's still creative. I mean, you're talking about art. Every text, other than in argument and language analysis, in all other sections of the course, it's the arts. You're talking about art. I mean, at universities, you do a Masters of Fine Arts in creative writing. That's like if you're a writer, that's what you would be studying. Yeah. The play explores the idealism of the impatience, but also those characters deemed normal and functioning members of society. So it's saying that, all right, not only are the nutters idealistic, full of idealism, but even normal people can be overly idealistic. However, Mr. Naura, that's the author, seems to infer, you can just call him Naura, however, Naura seems to infer that while idealism is admirable, too much of it becomes delusion. So there's the clause, yeah? The cause is defined by their idealism. Idealism is admirable. You want to be an idealistic person. If you had no ideals, you'd be a vacuum, a moral vacuum. But too much idealism is delusion. Cosy reminds audiences that for better or worse, we are all, whether sane or insane, because some of the characters are sane and some are insane, and you start to wonder who's who. Cosy reminds audiences that for better or worse, we are all, whether sane or insane, compelled by our idealism, but also by our institutionalisation. and that each one of us is compelled to on cue act a role on the burnt out stage of life, because they burn down the stage, the impatience in the play. So you want to have a poetic voice, you want to use quotes, you want to be dealing with the prompt, but with a contention. So it says here, in this contention, several things are clear. A clear but multidimensional viewpoint on the topic, a contention with a clause or a qualifier. B, that multiple interpretations exist, and the student is willing to take a multifaceted approach and include a discussion of both sides of the question. See where the essay is headed? You want to signal that. Don't tell me everything you're going to say in every paragraph. It's reductive. But tell me what you're going to build towards saying. What your hint at your revelation, rather than telling me didactically everything you're going to say. That's the job of the topic sentence, to outline what you're going to say in that paragraph. But you don't need to tell me in the introduction and conclusion. That's sort of hammering the point. This intro does not list out all the ideas of each paragraph in a boring, repetitive way. That in this case, the question is more thematically and socially focused. That's what's dealing with that. The study design asks for these things, to consider these things in number 4. That the text is open to multiple and varied interpretations, which, provided they're supported with quotable textual evidence or examples, and are not entirely preposterous or justified. So there's lots of plausible right things, there's wrong things, but there are many plausible interpretations, provided you support them with evidence. That the text is a construct, that it has an author, somebody who wrote it and made certain artistic, literary, theatrical and socio-political decisions while doing so, or poetic and filmic, that you need to show an implicit or explicit awareness of. Also, that the writer who constructed the text had certain authorial intentions, or the director or whoever, and used certain literary techniques to communicate these. Therefore, you are a reader critiquing the text in your essay, and you must employ the use of meta-language to show evidence of this. Meta-language being the language for talking about language. All right, let's go down here. I want to look at now at the topic sentences. So it's that same quote. To what extent are the characters in Cosy defined by their idealism? What I ask my students to do when they're practicing is I say, go and get a heaps of topics. And you're going to write some of them into full essays, yeah? You're going to write some of them up into full essays, but you can't write every topic up into full essays. But you should be able to write your topic and linking sentences, because they're the bits, so often when I'm reading my students' work, they're talking about the text, and then they're getting toward the end of the paragraph and you're like, now you're going to give me the really good interpretation. And it's got to be nuanced, and it's going to be insightful, and it's going to be perceptive. And you know what happens? Sometimes they don't do it, but when they do it, they don't have the language to do it properly, because they haven't practiced it enough. Because that's the bit that's hard to qualify. You're dealing with the tensions, the contradictions, the implications. And you've got to practice writing that stuff out. So what I always say is, yes, gather your quotes under topics, but also write like 20 linking sentences. Imagine you're coming to the end of paragraphs after paragraphs, because there's always more you could say. You know, you're not going to say everything you can about the text and the question in 800 words. But write them and then form them, and that way you're practicing expressing those nuanced ideas. You've expressed them before. In the exam, you should not be really having to write that complex perceptive idea for the first time. Yes, you might be adjusting it slightly. Yeah. So I just get them to practice writing linking sentences. Look at the prompt, think about the prompt, talk about it. We generally talk about it for 15 minutes, and then now write as many ideas drawn from your thinking. You've got to kind of think like in a circuitous way in terms of ideas. Here's the prompt. What happens in the text? Sometimes you can even think, what happens in life? What happens in other texts that I've read in relation to this prompt? What are the lessons that come from this? And then you say, okay, well, what happens in this particular book? What do these characters experience? What do these poems show? What does this event say? What was that author saying to that audience? And then from that, you look at the topic or the prompt, and you start to write the ideas. So let's have a look. This one's about the characters being confined by their idealism. And I've just gone through and said, for instance, Although written in the early 90s, Cossie is set 2 decades earlier. The 1970s were a time of great social change, such as the sexual revolution, the second wave of feminism and the decline of a long period of rule by a conservative federal government in Australia. These factors, combined with rising anti-war sentiment, invoke zealous new social and political ideals. So I'm situating the text within a time of idealism. It's written in the 70s. The 70s, like, you know, an idealistic time. Love is presented by Nowra as a form of idealism. So I'm going to think, well, I think to myself, well, what are people idealistic about? They can be idealistic about politics, art, love. You know, in my ideal world, I don't come here on the school holidays to get paid because I've already got a trust fund that I don't need to be here. You know, believe me, I wouldn't be for free. So the point is that we all have ideals. Sometimes they're materialistic, sometimes they're emotional, sometimes our ideal can be another person. Sometimes our ideals are our own, sometimes they're ideals we're told to have. You know, we mirror the social ideals around us. So I start thinking love is presented by Nowra as a form of idealism that can be troublesome and painful as a drug addiction, but is worth preserving nonetheless because it can also be the rocket to the stars and reveal the best of human nature. Because in the text we see some characters who are sort of in the institution because of failed love lives, yeah? And sometimes like domestic violence and so on. If individuals become too starry-eyed or chimerical, if you're chimerical you believe in dreams too much, you live in your dreams, they may find themselves in conflict with those ideals that are deemed to be important components of accepted social norms. Sometimes your idealism means that you're not normal anymore. So you start to go through and practice writing these ideas, and these can inform your topic and linking sentences, because that's interpretation. In the body of the paragraph comes the link. And then if you go back to, where is it? Who's doing all about Eve? Is anyone doing all about Eve? I might be off now. That's good. How do I zoom in? Oh, there. Sorry. I use a Mac, so it's a bit harder for me. I know burial rites is pretty popular, so let's have a look at that one. The landscape depicted in the text reflects the people Agnes interacts with, cold and hostile. To what extent do you agree? So, what would you say about this one? What would you say? Even if you haven't read the book. What is it conflating, first of all? People with their environment, yeah, so burial rites are set in Scandinavia, so it's that idea of like people being cold and, you know, a bit dark because of the climate, but like I'm Australian, I'm acculturated here, and I wouldn't necessarily think that I typify too many of the values or the stereotypes of Australia. So I start to think about, well, okay, I haven't read this book, but I'm assuming like not everybody the character meets is cold and hostile. There must be people who assist. Yeah. And then I might say to myself, well, maybe also if this character, I'm assuming it's she, Agnes, if she does meet lots of cold and hostile people, is she cold and hostile? And if she is, why is she? What made her that way? Is she just innately cold and hostile, or is she cold and hostile because of her circumstances or experiences? And then I might say, well, how does the author use landscape and the descriptions of landscape, and do people always reflect their landscape? You know, like what is it about the connection between a time and a place? Because I know this text is set in the past, so it's before like globalism and so on, so it would have been monocultural, everybody living in the same, you know, being from that place for centuries. And then I think about power, interacting. Agnes is a woman, it's set in the past. How do they interact? So I think, well, when we interact with someone, every interaction is imbued with some kind of power relationship. You know, really, every single one. Particularly in our culture. Sometimes, so I might think about that. And the word I think depicted in the text reflects. Yeah. In the next one, regardless of their social position, the characters in burial rites feel powerless. Do you agree? I mean, the reality is you wouldn't want to suggest that people with powerful positions might feel powerless too, but it's different. Like if you're a woman or in that time, or a poor person or something like that, or a migrant or something, in the 1900s you might feel more powerless. But yes, you could still feel powerless. Also, Scandinavia is a pretty brutal, cold climate, so you might feel powerless in terms of the natural world. So you start to break down, and if you've read the text, who's doing this text? If you've read the text, you can then start to break down, well, what happens in the text that show those things? The most important thing, though, to remember, and it's again, I'm just going to go back to this here. I think we've got to finish now, so we'll just do it. But just make sure that you definitely go back to reading and comparing the, to the examiner's report. If you just find it here. It's on VCA if you haven't read it yet. It goes back through because it has on section A what they're looking for. And because it is a new study design, this is important. Yeah, so this is the only one. Normally you'd have like 7 years of examiner's reports. But if you go back, it will clarify any questions that you might have. If you have any other questions, you can ask me at the end. So I'll wait here for 10 minutes and you can come and ask me. I think I'm only meant to finish at 4:30, yeah, not 4:45, yeah. All right, well, good luck. Good luck with your exams. Yeah.